Let's be very clear about something before we get into any of this. The Vatican does not make scheduling mistakes. The Holy See has operated as one of the most disciplined diplomatic institutions on earth for over 2,000 years. When the Pope grants an audience, it is a deliberate, calculated, sovereign act. And when the Pope does not grant an audience, that is equally deliberate, equally calculated. And right now, that silence is deafening for JD Vance. Because here's what just happened. According to a Vatican source who spoke directly to Reuters, Secretary of State Marco Rubio is confirmed to travel to Rome and sit down face-to-face with Pope Leo XIV, one-on-one. Just Rubio and the Pontiff. And JD Vance, the highest-ranking Catholic in the United States federal government, the Vice President of the United States. A man who flew to Rome less than a year ago to personally embrace the first American-born Pope in history was not invited. Not a scheduling conflict, not a logistical issue, a deliberate exclusion. And trust me, by the time we're done today, you will understand exactly why. To understand how we got here, you need to understand what JD Vance actually did. At a Turning Point USA event, with cameras rolling and a crowd cheering him on, Vance looked directly into those cameras and told Pope Leo XIV, the supreme pastor of the Universal Catholic Church, that he needed to be careful when talking about theology. Let that sink in for a second. The Vice President of the United States publicly lectured the head of 1.4 billion Catholics about his grasp of his own doctrine.
That it's important, in the same way that it's important for the Vice President of the United States to be careful when I talk about matters of public policy, I think it's very, very important for the Pope to be careful when he talks about matters of theology. But I think one of the issues here is that if you're going to opine on matters of theology, you've got to be careful, you've got to make sure it's anchored in the truth, and that's one of the things that I try to do, and it's certainly something I would expect from the clergy, whether they're Catholic or Protestant.
Now, Vance invoked just war theory to do it. He argued there's a 1,000-year tradition of the church blessing military action under the right conditions, and he's technically correct that the tradition exists. Saints Augustine and Thomas Aquinas developed just war doctrine over centuries, and it does allow for armed conflict under specific moral conditions. But here is where Vance either doesn't know his theology or is deliberately misrepresenting it. And both possibilities are damning, because the central, non-negotiable tenet of that same 1,000-year tradition, the one Vance cited, is that war can only be justified in self-defense, and only after all peace efforts have failed. That is not an opinion. That is the Catechism of the Catholic Church. Vance didn't cite just war theory. He selectively quoted it to justify a war the church is actively saying does not meet the standard. That is not theological literacy. That is theological malpractice. And if you thought the Pope standing his ground was the end of it, wait. Because the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops didn't stay silent either. They issued a formal written statement pushing back at Vance directly. Look at what the Bishop's Chairman on Doctrine put into the public record. For over 1,000 years, the Catholic Church has taught just war theory, and it is that long tradition the Holy Father carefully references in his comments on war. A constant tenet of that 1,000-year tradition is a nation can only legitimately take up the sword in self-defense once all peace efforts have failed. And then they went further. They stated plainly that when Pope Leo speaks as head of the Universal Church, he is not merely offering opinions on theology. He is exercising the ministry of the Vicar of Christ, a formal rebuke of a sitting vice president by the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. Let that land. That is not a Twitter argument. That is an institutional response from the governing body of American Catholicism, putting their position in writing for the historical record. And JD Vance, the self-described devout Catholic convert, got corrected by his own church's leadership in the most official way short of an excommunication proceeding. But here's what makes this even more extraordinary. This is not a new feud. This beef did not start when Leo became Pope. It started when he was still Cardinal Robert Prevost, born on the south side of Chicago, White Sox fan, quietly running a religious order. Because before he ascended to the papacy, Cardinal Prevost used his personal social media account to reshare a pointed rebuke of the Trump administration's immigration crackdown. and specifically called out JD Vance. He amplified an op-ed from a Catholic auxiliary bishop in Washington, D.C., highlighting the suffering of migrants being deported to El Salvador. And then look at this. On your screen right now, he reshared a Catholic newspaper article titled, JD Vance is wrong. Jesus doesn't ask us to rank our love for others. Before he was Pope, the man who is now the supreme pastor of the global Catholic Church went on record publicly, under his own name, saying JD Vance had misread the gospel. This is not a pope who stumbled into a dispute with Vance by accident. This is a pope who had Vance's number before he even had the keys to the Vatican. And now Vance wants a reunion meeting. And the answer from Rome is, Rubio's welcome. You are not. Now let's talk about what's been happening in the months leading up to this Vatican freeze-out, because the Pope story doesn't exist in a vacuum. According to reporting confirmed by the White House itself, JD Vance was dispatched to Islamabad, Pakistan, to lead the U.S. delegation in peace talks with Iran. He went, he negotiated, and the talks collapsed without a deal. Iran state television reportedly posted a meme mocking him. No agreement was reached. And then, in the move that should alarm anyone paying attention to how power actually operates inside this administration, when the next round of talks resumed, Vance was not sent back. The White House confirmed that Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner were dispatched instead. The Vice President of the United States, who personally led the first round of negotiations, was benched for the sequel and replaced by the president's son-in-law. Now contrast that with what Secretary Rubio was doing at the same moment, standing in a makeshift war room at Mar-a-Lago, shoulder to shoulder with Trump, photographed at the center of the most consequential foreign policy moment of this administration. Meanwhile, the image that circulated of Vance during that same crisis was him sitting at the head of the Situation Room table in Washington alone, drinking a Mountain Dew. That image became a symbol, not because of the soda, but because of what it represented. A vice president physically and politically removed from the room where power was being exercised. Reports also surfaced that Vance had been quietly leaking his opposition to the Iran war through anonymous channels, attempting to distance himself from a conflict he saw as a political liability. But rather than protecting him, it made things worse. Trump, aware of the situation, reportedly asked aides to formally rank Vance's performance. And by multiple accounts, the answer coming back from inside the White House was consistently Rubio. Here is where we get to the data. And the data is brutal. CNN's chief data analyst, Harry Enton, ran the aggregate polling numbers and delivered a verdict that is now part of the political record. JD Vance entered office in January 2025 with a net approval rating of positive 3 points. He now sits at negative 18. That is a 21-point collapse. And when Enton benchmarked Vance against every modern vice president at a comparable point in their tenure, Dick Cheney at positive 37, Joe Biden at positive 4, Mike Pence at negative 7, Kamala Harris at negative 13, Vance comes in dead last. Historically, the least popular vice president at this stage of a vice presidency in the modern era by a significant margin. But the poll numbers are only part of the picture. According to reporting from NBC News, The Wall Street Journal, ABC News, and Axios all separately confirmed Trump has been running his own informal succession poll at private donor events. At a Mar-a-Lago gathering that included prominent Republican donors, Trump asked the room directly, Rubio or Vance? The cheering, according to multiple people in attendance, was overwhelmingly for Rubio. One attendee described it as almost unanimous for Marco. And Rubio's Vatican audience confirmed today is being read by every political operative in Washington for exactly what it is. Not just a diplomatic meeting, but a status signal in MAGA's 2028 succession race, the soft power play of the year. Now let's pivot to the other side of the aisle, because this is where the story gets genuinely uncomfortable for anyone invested in the future of the Democratic Party. Axios published a bombshell report on Sunday. With audio, here's what that recording allegedly captures. Bob Brooks, a Democratic congressional candidate, president of Pennsylvania's Professional Firefighters Association, and a close Shapiro ally told a group of Democratic college students at Lehigh University something that was never meant to be public. He said that Governor Josh Shapiro asked his union to endorse Republican Stacey Garrity in the 2024 Pennsylvania state treasurer race over the Democratic candidate, Aaron McClelland. The stated reason: McClelland had publicly criticized Shapiro's vice presidential ambitions. Now look at what McClelland actually posted. It is right there on your screen. She said she wanted a VP pick who was secure enough to be second under a woman, who would not undermine the president for personal gain, and who didn't sweep sexual harassment under the rug. She was referring to Shapiro's former top aide, Mike Vereb, who faced a harassment allegation in 2023, stayed in his position for months after the complaint was filed, and left only after Shapiro's administration quietly reached a settlement with the accuser for $295,000. McClelland put those concerns on record publicly, and allegedly based on Axios' reporting and the audio they obtained, the political retaliation followed. Here is why this matters, beyond a state treasurer's race in Pennsylvania. Stacey Garrity, the Republican that Shapiro allegedly helped to victory, is a documented election denier. She spoke at a rally at Pennsylvania's state capitol on January 5th, downselling RCE, the day before the Capitol attack, calling to decertify Pennsylvania's votes for Joe Biden. At a Trump rally in 2022, she said, "We know that he won." Reports suggest she has since attempted to walk back some of those statements. But the record is the record. And if these allegations are accurate, what we are looking at is a Democratic governor potentially directing union resources toward an election-denying MAGA Republican to defeat a member of his own party as personal payback for a perceived slight about his ego. Shapiro's spokesperson called Brooks's comments inaccurate. Brooks himself said he misspoke, but Axios says they have the audio. They published it. The question hanging over Shapiro's political future is not going away. Look at what we are actually watching in real time. On the Republican side, the Vice President of the United States is being publicly frozen out by the Pope, replaced in peace negotiations by the president's son-in-law, sidelined at the most consequential foreign policy moments of this administration, polling at historic lows, and watching a quiet draft Rubio movement organize among the donor class all simultaneously. That is not a rough patch. That is a structural unraveling of a political brand that was supposed to be the future of the Republican Party. And on the Democratic side, the man many have been positioning as a future standard bearer is now the subject of a sourced, recorded Axios report alleging he directed union support toward a MAGA election denier to settle a personal score. If that allegation holds, it is a story about exactly the kind of transactional, vindictive political behavior that voters on the left have been told for years is the other party's problem. Both stories matter, not as gossip. They matter because 2028 is going to be fought on one central question: who can actually be trusted with power? The Vatican does not make scheduling mistakes. The question is whether American voters are paying close enough attention to what Rome and Axios and CNN and the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops are all trying to tell us at the same time. Drop a comment below. Tell me who you think the real 2028 frontrunner is on either side, because this race is far more open than anyone in Washington is willing to admit publicly. Subscribe if this gave you the full picture. We are just getting started.